This presentation is about the principles of assessment and testing, particularly in a second language. Although you will see that a lot of these principles actually apply to any discussion of testing and assessment in a wide variety, across a wide variety of disciplines. The first question we need to think about when we start talking about testing and assessment is what is the relationship of testing and assessment to teaching? And then what's the difference between testing and assessment? Because clearly I'm using those as two different terms. So if you take a look at the slide or the presentation here on the side, you can see that there's a bullseye. It looks a bit like a target. The widest ring there is teaching, and that should encompass the most of what teachers do, where they actually present information and provide feedback and support for their students. The inner two rings, the middle one is assessment, and the very middle one, or the bullseye, is the testing. And this shows you really the relative proportion of what you might want to do as a teacher. You might want to do more teaching, a little bit less assessment, and even less testing. But you can see that these things are all completely related. They all fall within the same circle, and they should be very closely connected. The difference between testing and assessment is sometimes there's a little bit of a gray area, but we can more or less distinguish them in this way. A test is what you typically think of as a test, where you're sitting down, perhaps you're in a time-constrained context where you're in an exam or you have to finish by the end of a class period. Often it's a paper and pencil test, although of course you can have oral exams as well. Sometimes they're multiple choice. These are very typical characteristics then of a test, and we call those sort of traditional tests. Assessment is a broader category where a teacher forms a judgment about a student based on things that are observable to them. And of course you know that being a teacher is a hugely privileged occupation in the sense that you really get to know a lot about your students through your observation of them. And it's very difficult to divorce judgment from your observation of the student. For example, does the student come into class on time, or are they consistently late? Does the student come prepared to class with their textbooks and their notes? Is the homework done? Do they respond quickly and enthusiastically when you ask a question? Do they seem to move quickly into groups? Are they interacting frequently and in a positive way with their peers when you're doing group work? All of these types of observations then contribute to, as teachers, evaluation or assessment, we should say, an assessment of that student and how prepared they are to class and how well they are learning. So one interesting question then that follows is if assessment and teaching are, obviously you can see assessment and teaching are very carefully and closely linked. In that case, can there be teaching without assessment, or can there be assessment without teaching? There's no right or wrong answer to that question, but it's a good question to ask yourself when you're being reflective about your own teaching practices. People may say on the one hand that no, you can't teach without assessing. When you teach and you're presenting and you're working with students and you're facilitating their learning, you're going to observe things that tell you how well that student is learning, and it's important for the teacher then to assess and to gauge how well that student is learning in order to help them better. So that teaching and assessment are inextricably linked. On the other hand, you may say as a teacher that, you know what, I really think it's important that students work in a non-judgmental environment where they can make mistakes without being judged, and all I'm doing is working with the students and I'm absolutely not judging them, and I won't do that until it's time to test them. And you may feel quite strongly, actually both positions sound quite reasonable. So again, it's a rhetorical question and it's one that you can reflect on, but it's something that's important to think about when you're teaching and when you're working with students. The next thing I want to tell you about then are the principles of testing and assessment, and the principles apply equally to both testing and assessment. There are 5 commonly recognized principles. These are validity, reliability, authenticity, practicality, and washback. There are lots of good definitions for validity. Lots of excellent researchers and writers have crafted different definitions of validity that are useful, a useful place to start. So I'm going to read you some definitions here. There are lots of different definitions of validity, and many great researchers and writers have written about how they perceive validity. It's a complex idea, and it's probably the most complicated of the principles. I'll read you some of the definitions here. Here's one. Validity is the extent to which inferences made from assessment results are appropriate, meaningful, and useful in terms of the purpose of the assessment. And that's by Groenland, and you can see the date at which he wrote that. I don't know about you, but it's actually a little bit difficult to understand or interpret, I think. Here's another one by Douglas Brown. Validity is the degree to which a test measures what it claims or purports to be measuring. We're getting a little bit more focused here in the definition. Again, it may be still a little bit challenging to understand. Here's another one. Validity is the extent to which a test measures what it is supposed to measure and nothing else. So these are three very common definitions then that you'll hear for validity. So you've had a look at these definitions, but what do they actually mean? Oftentimes definitions of validity boil down to really the understanding that a test should test what it's supposed to test. And does that make sense to you? You may very well want to ask, well, what should a test test then? And there's a lot of different answers to that. And we talk about validity being a multifaceted concept. I'm going to talk to you about two of those facets in particular that I hope is going to answer the question, what should a test test? The most obvious answer is that a test should test what you've taught. And there should be a very clear link between things that you've taught in class and the tests that you develop. The test should look quite similar, the test activities and the test items should look quite similar to what your students have done in class. And of course what they've done in class should be directly translatable to your curriculum objectives or your outcomes or your course outline with the outcomes or objectives stated clearly on that. So there should be a direct link between your stated objectives, what you've done in class, and what the students are doing in their test. And if there's a good match between what you've taught and what you're testing, then we call that content validity. So that's what they say when we say, oh, that test is content valid. That's really good. It means that there's a really good match between what was taught in class and what was tested. You may think then that testing what you should test is an easy thing. But in fact, and actually, tests are getting quite a bit better now than they have in the past in terms of we're looking at standardized tests. Standardized tests are more valid than they have been in the past. But let's consider the kind of thing that might happen in an oral test. Let's say you've been teaching an oral skills class and you've been working on pronunciation. And you decide, however, that for your final test you don't actually have time to do an individual test one-on-one with the students. And so you decide, in order to save time, that you're going to have a written test of phonetics. And certainly phonetics plays into good knowledge of phonetics, plays into good pronunciation. But we would say there that that's really questionable content validity, because if you've been teaching the class in a very oral way where your students have been working and producing oral texts, then to be tested in a written form, that's completely switching the skill on them and the focus. So we would say that that's questionable content validity. Another facet of validity is what we call construct validity. And construct validity is a little bit different. The answer to the question, what should a test test? Does the test test what it should? Another way of looking at that is to look at the research. Look what the researchers, second language researchers, have discovered about the skills that are required for a particular modality that you happen to be testing. So let's say you happen to be testing writing. What is it that researchers say, that research has proven are components that constitute good writing? Typically the research has shown in the past that content, organization, and form are three very important elements in good writing. And so what you need to look at then is, does your test those three elements that have been defined in research and accepted by the research and the teaching community as being important sub-skills to the skill of proficient writing? So you want to look at your test and you want to see, am I asking my students, if you're testing writing, are you asking your students to write something where content and organization and form are tested? Now you may be a little wondering, I'm using the term form, and sometimes people use form or accuracy. These are very fancy words for really grammar. And we use form and accuracy though instead of the term grammar now, because we often think of grammar as just applying to the written word, and we want to also be able to translate this into a spoken context when we look at spoken texts that our students produce. So what we mean is form and accuracy in speaking, which would relate to pronunciation, as well as in writing. Accuracy in writing, of course, means grammar. So when I talk about form or accuracy, it's just another way for me to say grammar. And we know that content and organization and form or grammar are inextricably linked. And so when we're grading for something in writing, for example, a written text, we want to make sure that we always have provide a mark for content, a mark for organization, and a mark for form at the very least. You may decide, depending on your context, that it's really important to provide a mark for vocabulary range. Perhaps that's been one of your objectives in your class, is to build your students' vocabulary. And so then it's totally appropriate, completely valid then to provide a mark for vocabulary range as well. But the question of construct validity then recognizes, is there a match between what the test tests and what research has proven as important sub-skills to the proficiency in a particular skill, either writing, reading, listening, or speaking. Now I want to give you an example of questionable construct validity. So again, let's assume then that you've been teaching an essay writing class, and throughout the term your students have produced different types of essays. And then in your final exam, you ask students to write an essay, so that seems to be good content validity there. But when you grade it, you grade for organization and for form only, and you don't provide a mark for content. That would be questionable construct validity, because you're not recognizing that content and accuracy and organization to a certain extent can be traded off one against the other. For example, you can increase your accuracy by simplifying your content, and this is a strategy that some students who are feeling really pressed to get good marks, this is what they try. So they would simplify their content and they would increase their accuracy of their grammar, but in fact the total overall product is less proficient or is less good. And so because you've ignored one of the elements in the construct of writing proficiency, you have demonstrated then questionable construct validity on your test. The next principle to consider is reliability. And reliability affects your test, and reliability is related to the consistency of your test. And like validity, reliability is multifaceted, so you can look at things that would create a lack of consistency in your test. You can look at that in several ways. The three ways I want to look at it are student-related reliability, rater reliability, and test reliability. So let's begin with student reliability. Student reliability is all the different variety of factors that can affect your student's state of mind before they write the test, which may result in an outcome or a score, for example, that doesn't reflect their true proficiency. So there's lots of these. You can probably imagine many of them. If the student doesn't feel well, for example, it's just not a good day for them, or if they've had a fight with their parent or their spouse or their partner or one of their children before they come in to write the test, that would understandably create an unsettled frame of mind. It might make them difficult, might make it hard for them to concentrate. Things like if the room is too cold, or if the room is too hot, or if there's too much noise, if the building's being renovated, all of these things then create conditions under which students are not able to perform at their best. And so the score that they get on that particular test might be different than the score they could achieve under ideal conditions. And so this is the reliability aspect of it, the potential inconsistency there between a student doing his or her best and a student who's impacted by these multiple kinds of conditions. It's difficult for the teacher to control for all of these different situations, but you can do some things that will help create the most ideal context for your students. For example, the room temperature, if it's too hot, open the door, open the window, that kind of thing. If there's renovations going on, and this is fairly pertinent, if there's renovations going on, ask please for no construction during the time of the test so that it's quiet. These kinds of things you can do to create the best possible condition. There's not much you can do about a student who's had an argument with a loved one before they come in. That's a real challenge for teachers to address. And that's a good reason why empathy and sympathy then are useful after the fact. The student may come to you later and say, well, I was very upset when I was writing. And then it's your judgment and what you can think about whether you'd like that student to have a chance to do that test again, or and how high stakes it was, and use your empathy there to make that judgment call. But these are all the factors then that influence student-rated reliability. If we look at rater reliability is related to how consistently the teacher scores the test, and all things related to consistency in that particular area, how the test is scored and whether that can be done in the most consistent manner possible. So you can think about this when you are marking a set of tests. You may approach the initial 10 tests with really positive and enthusiastic approach. I don't know if you'd be that enthusiastic, but maybe you're in a good frame of mind, you're feeling good, perhaps you've just had a snack, so you're not hungry, and you score those perhaps in one way. And by the time you reach the bottom 10 tests on that particular pile, you may be hungry, you may be tired of sitting, you may have forgotten some of the things you were looking for in the initial tests, that you got discouraged because you couldn't find those skills and evidence, and so perhaps you're a little discouraged by the last 10 tests or the last 5 tests. It can also happen that you have a feel that potentially one student is a little more proficient than another, and if you look back at the students' names at the front of the test, perhaps that might color your judgment in terms of your scoring. We all hope that that doesn't happen, but the reality is that these kinds of variables do influence how we score. And so we need to consider intra-rater reliability. That is, when one person is scoring a set of tests, we need to think of consistency across the marking of all of those tests. Of course, there's tricks that teachers use to increase the reliability. For example, we create rubrics which allow us to isolate different skills that we're looking for and assign specific marks or a mark range to that particular skill. And that what we're trying to do there is keep our judgment constant across a wide range of tests. So we do that. Rubrics are great for helping to do that. And you do the sensible things. If you're getting tired, you stop and you take a break. If you need to stretch, go ahead and stretch. If you need food, go ahead and have a meal or a snack or whatever, and then come back to the testing, to the marking at other times. It can be a challenge to do this because often we are rushed when we are marking. It's the night before, we want to give them back, and so we may compromise our reliability a little bit there in order to get them back in time. And try not to do that. Intra-rater reliability is really the study of all of those issues that impede consistency with one single scorer. you can imagine then how complicated this becomes if we look at a test that's scored by multiple scores. And when we look at consistency across multiple scores or multiple markers, we call that inter-rater reliability. And what we try and do is to control for all the variables that must be present when multiple people mark a single exam, or mark sometimes hundreds of thousands of exams if you're looking at a standardized test context. How can we control for that inconsistency, potential inconsistency? Again, one of the things we do is we fall back on rubrics, very clearly defined ways in which scorers must score. And before any scoring activity happens, standard procedure is to get all the scorers together and to have what they call a benchmark session. And what happens there is that the scorers all read out or listen to the variety of texts that students are producing, and everybody scores individually, and then everybody discusses. And so you'd say, well, I gave that a C+ because of this. Well, I gave it a C because of something else. And you work through all of that discussion and determine then what would be the best score for that paper or that oral text or whatever it is that you're scoring. You talk about potential variations, what would happen if the student had a little bit better form but their content was a little bit worse. Usually that benchmark session, the markers work through, could be 5, even 6 papers or texts before they split up individually to mark. And the attempt there is to make sure that everybody's marking in a consistent fashion to reduce the variability. And there are certainly, any test that's doing that, you probably at some point want to do some statistical analysis to see if that consistency across multiple scores is actually being achieved. And you can do statistical analysis to see if that's actually happening. The next principle I want to talk to you about is authenticity. And authenticity relates to how close a match there is between the test task item and the types of things that students will be required to do once they leave your classroom. And so we want to have a good match between the test and what we call real world activity that students may engage in once they leave that classroom. So you want to have a good match there. And so there's several things to think about. You can have an authentic test item, so the activity itself that they engage in on the test parallels what they might do outside of the classroom. And one challenge there that teachers often have, for example, is if you might, for example, want to test your students' grammar knowledge through multiple choice. That's an easy, very objective way of testing grammar knowledge. The challenge there is that it's not particularly authentic. So when students leave the classroom, they're really not using their grammar in a way that allows them to look at a multiple choice item on a test. Really, grammar is very applied, and so if you want a good authentic match in terms of your test items, probably multiple choice is not a good way to go for a language test, because when their students leave the classroom, they don't have multiple choice questions to answer. They actually have to speak or they have to write. So it's not a good authentic match. Which is not to say that you should never use multiple choice, but just that you need to use it in a limited way so that you have other test items that ask students to apply their grammar knowledge to either speaking or writing. So that's one thing to consider, is the task type. The other thing you want to think about is the language within the test. So you want to make sure that the language is as natural as possible so that you're not creating some kind of stilted question. You're not asking students to manipulate grammatical forms so that they come up with something that they would never say outside the classroom. And I recall at one point writing a test item where I was asking students to use the passive, and I realized that what I was asking them to do was to write a sentence that was something like, the students would have been being something. And I thought, you know what? Students would never ever use that phrase outside that sentence outside of the classroom. So I just had to scrap that test item and rewrite another item that would allow students then to produce an answer that was a little bit more natural. So think about that in terms of authenticity of language as well. So we've talked about authenticity of your test task, and we've talked about authenticity of test language. The one last thing that I want to say about authenticity is that you should probably also consider authenticity of context. again, this should be a good match with what's happening outside the classroom. So if you've been, teaching on a specific topic, it should be a context or a topic that students will encounter outside of the classroom as well. Practicality is another principle that is really important to consider when you're developing a test. And practicality really relates to the logistics of the test itself. And it can range right from the development of the test, how much time does it take you to put the test together, how much time does it take to score it, and how are you going to provide feedback for the students? Is it going to be, are you going to be able to do that in a timely fashion so that students don't have to wait too long for feedback? All of these things bear on the practicality of a test. Budget as well. How much will it cost to administer the test? If you have to buy a computer that will play sound files for quite a few students in a variety of different rooms, and speakers to project that sound, how much is it going to cost you to do that? And how are you going to record student answers if it's an oral test? How many scores are you going to get to provide a consistent score for multiple test takers? And can you afford to pay all those scores if you're looking at multiple scores? All of these things then are related to the principle of practicality. And you can see here where there might be some trade-offs with some of the other principles. So we talked a little bit about the authenticity, or perhaps the lack of authenticity, of doing a multiple choice grammar test. Again, not to say that multiple choice should not be used, but it should just be used in recognition that that's only one element of grammatical accuracy, and that we need to look at grammar ability applied to speaking and writing as well. However, what I want to say here is that you may decide for reasons of practicality that multiple choice is a good way to test grammar, even though it may reduce the authenticity of your test. It may increase the practicality. And so sometimes you have these trade-offs on these principles, and so you really need to balance your the principles that you have for your test. The last principle to talk about is washback. And washback is really another way of saying feedback. And you want to consider, when you're developing a test, how are you going to provide feedback to students? And who are the results for? Are the results for the student? Are the results for an administrator? Do the results go on a scorecard that gets sent to institutions for admission? What's the purpose? Most often when we're writing or developing a classroom test, we're looking at providing feedback directly to the students themselves. So how can we do that in a way that is positive? How can we do it in a way that doesn't overwhelm them? How can we do it in a way so that students don't have to wait too long for their test results? Because when students complete a test, they're anxious to know how they did. So how can we provide feedback? Should we do it orally? Should we do it in written form? Should we provide a score or a grade? All of these things then you need to consider when you're thinking about washback. Talking about these principles is one thing, but being able to apply them is another thing. So what I want to do now is give you a couple of examples, and what we'll try and do is we'll apply the principles to these examples to see if the test that has been developed in the example is a good example of the different principles. So here's our first example. All right, our first example then, let's assume that we're looking at a standardized test of English proficiency. So this is a kind of test that samples all the students' skills and says that it will produce a score that will determine that student's proficiency either for admissions to college or university, or to work, or perhaps a standard for employability. Usually proficiency tests then will look at reading, writing, listening, and speaking, or they should, if that's what they say they are. All right, now in the past we have had standardized tests of English proficiency that have no oral skills component. Again, this is done because often it's very difficult to have one-on-one time with students to record their oral skills. So in the past, it has been decided that in fact, for practical reasons, to skip that oral skills test. So you might have then a standardized test of English with no oral skills, and student writing might be tested by multiple choice grammar questions. And the listening comprehension part of the test is a poor quality sound file that's played in a large room where there may be echoes. And finally, students receive a single score on their on their test. So let's look at how the principles apply in this particular situation. We would ask, is this test valid? Well, certainly it's hard for us to tell for a proficiency test in terms of content validity because we can't see what was taught before the students were tested. But we can certainly consider construct validity, and we can see that if writing is tested through multiple choice and there's no oral skills test, then it's very difficult to provide a good, an accurate score on someone's overall English proficiency. So we can say that no, the test is certainly not valid. Is it reliable? Well, it's hard to say. Reliability may be variable across different sections of the test. For example, if you have multiple choice grammar questions, the scoring is very objective for multiple choice questions. So we could say that the reliability of that kind of scoring would be good. But the test reliability would be quite poor because the sound file, poor quality sound file played in a large room will certainly introduce some element of inconsistency in terms of where the student is sitting in the room, how well they can hear. There's certainly going to be some inconsistency there in the results. So overall, we would say that the test is not particularly reliable. Is it authentic? Does it ask students to do the kinds of things that they would need to do when they leave the classroom? Probably not. Okay, so if again, multiple choice with no oral skills test, really not very authentic. Is it practical? Yes. And probably this is why the test was developed in this way, was purely on considerations of practicality. It would not be expensive. It would not require too many scores. The scoring would be very objective and not subjective. You wouldn't have to work one-on-one with an oral text. And if students only receive a single score, it's probably easy to provide that feedback. So yeah, we'd say it's quite practical, but really at the expense of the other principles. And then the question is, does it have positive washback? Remember, with washback, we really want students to leave the whole testing experience feeling good about, if not feeling good about the result, then certainly feeling good about the way forward. So they should have identified areas of their strength and then also areas of weakness, and the washback should have given them an idea of how to proceed, how to address their weaknesses, or what to do next. And so generally, washback, we want to have positive washback, leave students feeling good. If students get a single score on this test, it's unlikely that they're going to have positive washback. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of comments that are provided, just a single score. So students don't have an idea of where their strengths and weaknesses are. And so we would say this test does not have positive washback. A second example of how we can apply the principles is an assumption. Let's assume then that students are writing a midterm test based on unit objectives. Okay, so if you've got that, what are students actually doing? Students write an essay, and the teacher uses a rubric to score content, organization, and form. And the test is returned within the week with individualized comments. Okay, so this might be, actually, it's quite typical of a lot of midterm tests for a written class. Let's apply the principles to this particular scenario. We want to ask ourselves, is the test valid? Well, if the midterm test is based on unit objectives, then there's a link there between curricular objectives and what they've been learning in class and what they're having to do in a test. So yes, we would say that it is a valid test. Is it reliable? Again, we would say, hopefully, yes, it's a reliable test. We know that the teacher uses a rubric to score the test, and so that suggests that it will be reliable. We don't have information about student reliability. We can't know whether students were feeling well or not on that particular day, but based on our scenario, we can say that it certainly looks like it was scored in a reliable way. Is it authentic? There you need to ask yourself, do students need to write essays when they leave their second language class? And I think most often, if the students are heading into an academic context, most often that is true. Probably the students will have to write essays in other classes when they leave their particular ESL class. So yes, we would say that it's probably authentic. Is it practical? Well, what do you think? When students write an essay and a teacher uses a rubric, I guess that makes it slightly easier for teachers, certainly to be consistent, but it is the scenario there described that the teacher returns the test with individualized comments. It's likely to take the teacher quite a bit of time to score. So the practicality for this particular test may decline. It depends how you look at it. You may say, well, actually developing a test where there's only one essay prompt, or perhaps two or three, so that the students had a choice of which essay question to address, that's actually didn't take long to produce that test, so we could say it's practical in that sense. If we look at the practicality of the scoring procedure, providing individualized comments, which is what teachers do all the time, that is reduced practicality for that. So we would say perhaps that this test is a little bit less practical than a multiple choice test, for example. Does it have positive washback? So this is where we want to consider the impact on the students of this particular test. And we would say that if you were a student getting that back, an essay back with the score and individualized comments, you'd probably feel pretty good about that, because the teacher would hopefully identify some of your strengths as well as some of your weaknesses and provide hopefully encouraging comments. So, and it's returned within a week. That's quite a reasonable time frame to return a set of essays. So it probably does, we would say that it does have positive washback. So this has been a brief discussion of the principles of assessment and testing. And you'll recall that the 5 main principles are validity, reliability, authenticity, practicality, and washback. And I hope that you're able to take these principles now and apply them to your own testing situation to perhaps improve your tests, and also that you have a good vocabulary now for doing analysis on other testing situations that you may observe. Good luck.